Get the fuck up! Put him down, dude!
In my house, open the door. A group of people, one of them puts a gun to my head. I'm pushed onto my knees, and that's it. Everything's darkened. And then there's two Americans. I said, "You're not going to torture us, are you?" He said, "No, son, we don't do that." It was reassuring, but he was lying. He injected me with something. I woke up 36 hours later in Guantanamo in a daze. And that's became my home in one way or another for the next 2 years. What they specifically wanted from me, especially the Americans, we want to know about a plot, anything. I'd been kidnapped, there's no other way to describe it. I was not being charged with anything. If you're in a place where accountability doesn't happen, you can do what you like. And that's exactly what happened. I've never harmed any American in any way in my life. But America can't say the same about me. These wars aren't stopping terrorism, they're causing them. If you kill people there, is it beyond the scope of possibility that people might want to kill people here? That's just the way human beings are.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of. Guantanamo Bay, that infamous institution we've all heard so much about. The orange jumpsuits. Obama wants to close it. Trump wants to reopen it. We've heard so many things about what goes on inside. So when I got the chance to speak to a former inmate, I jumped at it. And I got to sit down with Moazzam Begg. He's a fascinating man, a British citizen who was snatched from his home in Pakistan after the 9/11 attacks, held in detention in Afghanistan at a US base, and then taken to Guantanamo for 2 years, and then released without ever being charged. It's an incredible story, and it's a story that empowered this man to now work today to help people that have been affected by the war on terror. Sit back, watch this show, see what you can learn from his experience, and see what you can learn about the so-called war on terror, what we're doing right, and what we're doing wrong to people all around the world. I hope you enjoy this. It's a very, very important episode. London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Moazzam Begg, the former Guantanamo Bay prisoner who was featured in the BBC documentary The Confession: Living the War on Terror. The U.S. authorities held you as an enemy combatant and claimed you were an al-Qaeda member, yet you've never been convicted of any crime. Today, you're an advocate for the rights of those held at Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere, and serve as the director of outreach for CAGE, a London-based advocacy organization which aims to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. Moazzam, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me.
It's great having you on here. It's people would probably be surprised that we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about Ice-T, a rapper from America. And it's kind of strange that a kid that grew up in San Diego and someone that grew up in Birmingham were listening to the same hip-hop music. And I figured we might as well start there. Why were you listening to that music back then, and what did Ice-T tell you?
Well, I'm quite fascinated by the very fact that we're talking about somebody who impacted, I guess, both of our lives in different ways. For me, at that time in the 90s, in 1990 in particular, listening to the album OG, Original Gangster, it was about coming out of my teens. It was about learning who I was. It was about my own experience of fighting neo-Nazi skinheads here in the UK, being beaten up by them, told often, Paggy, go home, seeing neo-Nazi salutes, Sikh Heils, Nazi-style salutes. And in the face of that, trying to figure out, am I British? Am I Pakistani? Am I Asian? Am I a Muslim? What am I? Where do I fit in? And so Ice-T, listening to him around the same time when I started reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, helped to kind of direct me in a particular way. Part of that was to do with, I guess, some sort of rebellion, but more of it was about, if I don't feel like I can fit in society here, there are other places that I can look. And I think Ice-T was part of that journey for me. And it continued to develop. For me, it took a journey then afterwards where I found and believed that my identity that I felt most comfortable with was my Islamic identity, my Muslim identity, that I'd already inherited from my parents. And that was interspersed with different aspects of being British, being Pakistani, and so forth. But what I believed transcended, for me at least, my national identities was my faith and my Islamic identity.
Okay, so you're a young man searching for who he is. You're in your teens in Birmingham and you're trying a few different things, listening to this music. Now you're reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I read one time actually on a road trip when I was about 19 years old. Probably I was maybe drawn to similar things of rebellion, of anger against the system, trying to figure out who I was. And I was kind of attracted to these historical figures, and Malcolm X is a fascinating one, to say the least. But he's a black guy, and neither one of us are black. How do you understand that?
I think the experience, or at least the concept of seeing oppression or even perceived oppression and injustice versus justice, or somebody who stands up for it, is something that all of us, regardless of background, color, ethnicity, or race or religion, can see, even if we don't agree with them completely. For me, Malcolm X clearly had that transition from being a street gangster, somebody who sold dope, who put women on the streets and so forth, going to prison, having that transformation. Now that transformation for me was very, very important in reading his autobiography, because it linked to something. He joined the Nation of Islam, which essentially is exclusive to black people. So I couldn't relate to that. But what I could relate to is that when he has his journey to Mecca and the Hajj, and then he embraces Orthodox Islam, where white and black are equal. And in that moment, for me, that's when Malcolm X really penetrated my heart. I was listening, of course, to, as I said, Ice-T, and Ice-T would make reference to Islam, but he'd be talking about the Nation of Islam, Farrakhan and his movement and so forth. Whilst there are aspects of Islam that any Muslim could relate to in relation to that, they know it's exclusive for essentially for black people in America. And so mainstream Islam will never be part of that. And so for me, it was more of it cemented the idea for me that the direction I'm going to take is Orthodox Islam, and adhere to it and try to adhere to its principles. and not based upon my readings of old books and so forth, but something more contemporary. Malcolm X, a person who lived, and at least in my father's generation.
And the interesting thing is that by Malcolm seeing, when he went to the Hajj, and by seeing all these different races of people, he was like blown away. And that, you could argue, got him killed, because he came back and rejected the Nation of Islam and started kind of on his own path, made a lot of enemies, political things that were happening inside there, and, you know, he died.
I remember when I queued up for several hours in the rain in 1992 outside a bookshop here in Birmingham to buy a book. It was that was about the life of Muhammad Ali, and eventually I got through amongst all these hundreds of people, got him to sign my book, and I said to him, "You're the champ," and he replied, he had Parkinson's at the time, and he replied, turned around and said, "You call me a tramp?" And I was mortified, and then he just started laughing. But what that meant for me was, and looking and reading in his book, he says, I only embraced Orthodox Islam in 1982, meaning that one of the opponents of Malcolm at some point, even though he'd introduced him to Islam himself, was Muhammad Ali, because of this attachment to the nation. Whereas Malcolm, as you said correctly, once he took the path of Orthodox normative Islam, that's when he became a threat to some people, because now he started talking the message of universality and accepting people based not upon a color, which is supposed to be irrelevant, but upon a belief. And a belief is slightly different to something you have no choice with. Belief is a matter of choice. Color and race are not. And I think that was what sealed Malcolm's fate. Yeah,
because we got into a feud with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I believe, and of course he had recruited Muhammad Ali and a lot of the original ones, and then it got ugly. And we don't know all the details, but I think something kind of went wrong there. So that's kind of fascinating that you saw in that book that aspect of it.
Yeah, certainly. And even throughout my incarceration in Bagram, in Guantanamo, I came across the autobiography of Malcolm X by soldiers who were reading the book. And some soldiers who hadn't, I'd recommend to them, please read the book to form your own view, not just of your own American experience, but how that links to us, the prisoners here, because we are Muslims. And for some of the soldiers, it was the first ever interaction with Muslim prisoners. So I tried to explain to them that this is also part of the American experience, a journey to Islam. And it may be one that you might be interested in at least learning about and educating yourselves. And some of them did.
Why were they reading that book?
Again, mostly it was the black soldiers that I came across who had the book. And I saw various reactions. Some soldiers, say from, I don't know, Kentucky or from North Carolina, would say, oh, that's a racist book, he was a terrorist. Whereas the soldier would say, no, he wasn't. He was somebody who fought for our liberation and for our rights and so forth. So I think everybody, whether it was us prisoners, we're having our own hard time, but the soldiers were having a hard time, struggling, not only with being out on a deployment in a country where they don't speak the language and they don't understand the culture or the customs, but also about where do they fit in all of this. I came across one American soldier who told me he grew up on a reservation. Now he's a white Caucasian soldier, but he said that what was done to my people, meaning the Native Americans, even though he's white Caucasian, he said is like what we're doing to you right now. And he felt a massive conflict within himself about the abuses that we faced, that he was witnessing and in some cases part of, and what he knew had happened to the Native Americans. He saw some parallels about the way in which other people are treated. We were called enemy combatants, but prior to that, we were called enemy aliens. That was the official designation. So you're an enemy of the United States, but you're also an alien, meaning you're something different, you're something out of this world. And that language and that terminology, that attitude, stems back from a dark page, I think, in the United States history of otherization of people.
Whether it's Native Americans or the black people in America. It's a lot of this kind of a constant kind of revolution and transition, and then looking at ourselves. I know you famously have a friendship with one of your prison guards from Guantanamo. He came to the UK for your movie premiere, and it's a fascinating relationship, because obviously it goes to what you're talking about now. He was struggling with the fact that he had to do this job, which was to maybe terrorize you to a certain extent. I do want to get back to Birmingham, but can you talk about that briefly?
Well, I had relationships or friendships with several of the American soldiers, and at least 2 of them have visited me in my home. One in particular, Al, I remember him very well because I got to know these guys, and I got to go know these guys because of solitary confinement. Had I been in general population most of my time, I don't think those relations would have ever built up, because it's always would be a hostile situation, us and them in military combat gear, the US soldiers, and us in the orange. But in the uniqueness of being in solitary confinement in an enclosed room, there's nobody else, there's just you 2, whoever it happens to be that's on duty at that time. So I got to know East Coasters, West Coasters, people from the Midwest, black, white, Hispanic, and everything in between. I have never been to America in my life, but America has been to me, and it showed me a face of it that I didn't know existed, in a place that most Americans don't know exists in that way, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And therein, speaking to some of these soldiers, sometimes being a mentor to them or an advisor or a guide about relationships, about history, about culture, about politics, it was absolutely unique. It cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world. And those friendships, understandings, and interactions developed to a point at which I knew that some of these guys will be friends for life. No matter what happens, I will always think about them, and vice versa. And there are a number of people I've spoken to, phoned, talked to on Facebook. I mean, well, the wonders of Facebook, there's so many former soldiers on there I'm talking to. And then from there, it developed into, I want to come over and visit you. And in the relation to this particular Al, he's a guy from, from the West Coast, and he always treated me like a human being. He bought me things that I think would have got him thrown out the army. Just little things, maybe a little piece of chocolate, maybe a little movie that he brings up on a portable DVD player. The first time I ever saw the film Snatch was in Guantanamo Bay, because Al showed it to me. And these little acts of humanity, which, as I said, they cannot be replicated. So when Al eventually came over here, he stayed at my house. He met my wife, he met my child, who was born when I was in Guantanamo. And I said to him, Al, you are my guest here. And my wife cooked for him, and he just like a brother. And I just said to him, this time, Al, I'm going to warn you, I got the keys. And we laughed. He met my dad, he went into the community with me. People gave a standing ovation when they saw him and me hug and embrace. And these sorts of things, people make films about many, many years later, how the American soldiers go and meet the Viet Cong that they had fought once, or soldiers, GIs who fought in World War II and met the Japanese. This is happening right now. So whilst people may say that quote unquote radical Islam and America and everybody else cannot meet, cannot talk, cannot come to an understanding, I say that's already happening, but people don't want to hear about it.
And yet there's not a lot of these incidents. This probably comes down to a certain amount of your personality here.
Yes, except for the fact that there was about 800 prisoners in Guantanamo, and each of them has their story. The difference is that because you and I are speaking English, and we are, by definition, by necessity, only speaking to the English-speaking world, the rest of the world speaks Arabic and Pashto and Farsi and Turkish and Uyghur and Swahili, and the list goes on. And each has their own experience. And I was only in Guantanamo and Bagram for 3 years. There are people that have been there for 14, 15 years, so their experience is a multitude of more times than my own. And we're just not hearing about it, that's all.
Right. Well, I want to get back there at some point, but I also kind of want to go back to Birmingham. And can you tell us a bit what it was like back then? I guess it would have been in the 70s and even 80s in Birmingham. I think even recently, when Trump was elected, he made some comments about Birmingham, right? As in it was some divided state or something. What is Birmingham like today? Because I know you live there. And what was it like back when you were listening to Ice-T? What was it like growing up from an identity standpoint and everything else?
Birmingham today believes it is the second city. There's a dispute between Birmingham and Manchester. We believe Birmingham is after London the second city of the United Kingdom. Very proud to be from there. It's a very diversity. There's a large Muslim population there. That's what I think one of Trump's advisors said, that there are no-go zones. He'd gone to the extreme and said there are no-go zones where there are only Muslims and Sharia law is applied and so forth. I think people ridiculed that and made fun of it. I live in an area called Hall Green, and we joke that it's called Halal Green now after this place. But the truth is that it is a very mixed, diverse place. And that's quite different to how it used to be when I grew up. I grew up, as I said, at a time where people from second generation immigrant families were facing aspects of racism. There was the National Front, which still exists today. It's a racist party in Britain. There was the British movement that used to exist back then. There was something called the Anti-Paki League, which was essentially against Pakistanis or anybody deemed to be a Pakistani, which included Indians and Bangladeshis and so forth. Didn't matter, as long as you're brown, you fit the bill. And I got beaten up by some of these skinheads, and that's one of the reasons why I ended up joining a street gang called the Lynx. And this street gang, modeled itself on, I guess, gangs that existed in America in one way or the other. And that's also part of the connection, I guess, when I talk about Ice-T or others. We were connected to that kind of genre.
Did you have your own vests and colors?
We did.
Okay.
We did. There were ex-Italian
like the
army
Warriors.
We were very influenced by the Warriors. Okay. Very influenced by the idea of colors, by the idea of gangs, of regional gangs. That had a huge influence on us. In fact, we'd talk about it. We'd verbatim quote. I'll stick that bat up your ass and turn you into a popsicle. Those kind of things we verbatim quoted just amongst ourselves.
Right.
And that was part of growing up, listening to Beat It, Michael Jackson, which came a little bit later on the scene. But it was all part of
and that video was gangs fighting at the end.
It was, yeah. They were real gangs.
Yeah.
Right? And we knew that. We knew. And we were modeled on that kind of thing. So we had our ex-Italian army combat jackets. We had some kind of patch, I don't know from which army it was, but we all wore them as our kind of localized identity. And our raison d'etre was to fight the skinheads. And we did that, but as all gangs do, get involved in some kind of criminality or the other. That happened. So I knew lots of people who ended up going to prison for one thing or the other. I generally stayed out of it, but I was just only involved in the fighting part of it with the skinheads. But again, it's a very important journey. My dad came from Pakistan in the 60s. He was a banker, he was a very respectable kind of guy. He didn't face the kind of things that I faced. He wanted to work and make a life for his family and so forth. But I, growing up, going to school, getting picked on sometimes, or sometimes just trying to find out where I fit, I was gonna have a totally different experience.
And for the Americans that are listening that don't understand the dynamic between Indians, Pakistanis, Britain, I mean, obviously America had our waves of immigrants, right? Yeah. And back in the day, the Italians were the wops, and the Irish were the mix, and then the Mexican immigrants came in, but then as each generation assimilates, things change.
Yeah.
So how would you describe, and obviously the West Indians came here, I think in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So if you had to kind of break it down, how do the Pakistanis and Indians fit in, even in the Midlands, which is not like the big city here?
So there's a very strong link between the British and India. And India, when I say India, that would have included Pakistan was made into a country only in 1947. Prior to that, it was all India, and there was no Bangladesh. And so all of those, Britain had colonized India for at least 250 odd years. And my father was essentially a product of that. My father's father had been a soldier in the British Indian Army. He'd fought in the Second World War in the Western Front. His father had fought in the First World War and in the Boer War. And the history goes back hundreds of years to when they were part of the Mughal army that was the Mughals, or the Great Mughals. My father studied as a child in an English convent school. So he was very affected by the effects of colonization. He spoke English perfectly well before he came to the UK. And that was one experience of many people from the Indian subcontinent. So essentially, one of the reasons why we say there's so many here is because Britain was there, therefore we are here. There's kind of a reciprocation. And I know in America, when they talk about Asians, they mean East Asia. But here in Britain, when we talk about Asia, we talk about South Asians, people from the Indian subcontinent. And I guess that's part of our, it's always going to be part of my identity. But at the same time, you mentioned West Indians. I was growing up alongside West Indians. So I used to speak with a patois accent and talk like that, you know. And the only reason why that was the case is because so many of my friends had come from that background. And again, the rebellion was part of their culture, of some of the guys that I was growing up with. The Rastafarian movement, the reggae music, and localized responses to what they felt was police brutality, the targeting of black people. It was kind of, I wouldn't say to the extent of what was happening in America, but it was happening. The institutionalized racism was clearly happening here in the UK. And it was the black community then, it wasn't us. Asians were known for working hard, for keeping their heads down and so forth. And then that, eventually after 9/11 and so forth, things started to change.
Okay, and I want to talk on that. Talk to me about, as you get into your teens and early 20s, what's the transformation that's happening with you? What's going on in your head? And how do you start either reconnecting to Islam and start getting involved in other things?
I think there was a couple of things that happened. This was probably later in my late 20s and, early 20s and late teens. There was the war in Bosnia, which was the former Yugoslavia. I learnt for the first time I'd ever known, that there's an indigenous population of Muslims in the heart of Europe, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Slavic people who are getting killed essentially because they are Muslims. And to me that was shocking, fascinating, and all of those things. But I felt some kind of connection, though it was a loose. I didn't speak the language, I didn't understand the culture, didn't know their history, but I wanted to learn more. There was that happening. There was also the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War in 1991, against Saddam Hussein. It had the coalition, which included Britain, essentially bombing Iraq after they had invaded and occupied Kuwait. I was confused, and I found myself, I guess, feeling defensive of what was happening to the Iraqis, not because I understood anything about Iraq, but because I felt that this is, you know, what's Britain and America and everybody ganging up onto this country for? What's this really all about?
Okay, but it's a secular state. It wasn't necessarily a Muslim country.
No, that was irrelevant to me. It was just simply Muslim people there getting attacked by. But of course, it was more detailed than that. And other things like, well, I knew that Palestine had been occupied, I knew that South Lebanon had been occupied, I knew Kashmir had been occupied, but there was no movement to liberate those peoples there. So I felt that there's something else going on here. And as I learned later on, a lot of this was about interests. It wasn't necessarily about what's right and what's wrong at that particular time. So that was all. I started to get a little bit disillusioned with what Britain, the direction it was going. There was a time when I was going to join the British Army and following the tradition of my forefathers. I didn't do so because of racism and because of the first Gulf War, which I felt, for me as a Muslim, I can't see myself being in an army where I have to fight or be involved in something that would harm my co-religionists or people I'm trying to at least feel some connection to.
Okay, so that's how you felt about the UK. Yeah. How did you feel about America? Especially you're growing up with a lot of Americana.
To be honest with you, America seemed like a distant place, an extension of Britain. We speak English. The Americans speak English. And there was clearly lots of culture, music, film, and so forth, fashion coming over from America. So it was entering our lives without us even knowing. It was so plain. But as I said, I've never been to America, so I had no sense of America at all in real terms, in tangible terms.
Will you go? Can you go?
No, I don't think I don't think America would let me in, even if it wanted to. The time when it might have happened was Obama's time. I can't see Trump letting me in, I think.
What do you mean by even if it wanted to?
I think there are too many uncomfortable questions. Too many. My name now is synonymous with Guantanamo. It's almost Moazzam Begg Guantanamo. That's like, or Moazzam Guantanamo Begg.
And it forces the Americans to look at why they did that.
It will have to. And it won't be some Afghan villager who's unable to articulate himself. It's going to be me saying it as it is. Without exaggeration, but America's going to have to listen to one of the people that it tortured, that it abused, that it falsely imprisoned. And I've never harmed any American in any way in my life. But America can't say the same about me. So there will be some uncomfortable questions that will have to be answered. And I think, to my knowledge, not a single former Guantanamo prisoner has ever walked free on US soil.
But you have a British passport, so technically you can fly there without...
Technically, but I can't see that happening.
And you wouldn't? You would be concerned for your safety?
I would, very much.
Okay.
I don't mean the American people. I think American people are as good as bad as anywhere else. But I think administration, whichever administration that would be, I think that I would be at best detained and at worst detained for a very long time.
Okay. Back to Bosnia, and have you opened the bookstore yet? Because the bookstore, and if we look back at your whole story, seems to be where you first get on people's radar. Maybe talk about that in Bosnia.
So I took the first trips to Bosnia in 93, 94, and then I think 95 as well. So I went several times. I went with aid organizations initially to take food and aid, and I had been terribly affected by some survivors that I'd met in Birmingham, a woman, for example, a Bosnian lady who, it's harrowing just to even mention it, but she'd been raped multiple times. She'd been gang raped by Serb soldiers, and they chopped off the head of her child, and she nearly lost her mind. She cooked for us, I remember that day, and I felt so ashamed sitting there that this woman's cooking for us. And we know this story from her. She's relating part of the story to us.
Things were bad back then, and I just don't think the internet wasn't up and running.
No.
They weren't that well documented.
So we heard these stories either firsthand from people or from one or two individuals who'd gone over and recorded the stories, come back and made the video. There's one called Massacres in Bosnia and Croatia, which was horrific to watch. It wasn't for public consumption, but it was just horrific.
Right, mass graves, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely terrible. And of course, reports coming from there. So again, what connected me was my search for my identity, that I feel that I want to be connected more to the Muslim world, and here, right on the doorstep of Europe, something's happening and it needs your help, if you can.
Were you angry?
I was shocked, I was in tears, I'd cry at night, and of course I was angry.
Okay.
I was angry beyond, because when you hear something like that, you think of a member of your family. You think, what would you do if it was a member of your family? So of course I went, and I went with multiple intentions. One is to help an aid convoy, and possibly, if I can, join some military force. And I did both. After several convoys, I went on one, and when I joined the Armija Bosanska, which was the third corps of the Bosnian army, and it was the volunteer unit, which was essentially the foreign volunteers, and they were from all over the world, from the Muslim world.
Okay. What kind of people were there? What nationalities?
From Saudi Arabia, from Tunisia, from France, from Gambia, from Indonesia, Philippines. I mean, in fact, it was one of the first times when I'd seen that, wow, the Muslim world is massively diverse.
Like Malcolm X's journey.
Yeah, it's massively diverse, and it's for people from everywhere you can imagine. I mean, guys from Namibia. I didn't know there was Muslims in Namibia. And so people, Mongolia. So what I'd realized here is that they all come for the same reason. And of course, at the time, the concept of radicalism or terrorism wasn't really associated with the Muslim world the way it is today.
Yeah. We
were essentially on the same side as NATO, but NATO or the United Nations weren't doing anything. That was the point. I met Brits out there, I met Pakistanis out there, all from the United Nations, Bangladeshis, Canadians. Everybody was there watching it happen, watching the massacres, the largest genocide on European soil since World War II was happening, and everybody sat and watched, except for this unit of fighters who fought back.
Right, and you were on the same mission as NATO, because NATO was saying they were trying to prevent these things.
Right.
Were they bombing then, or not?
Well, credit to the Americans, and I know one American soldier, he said something to me that shocked me when I was in custody. He said, listen, we came to Bosnia and we helped the Muslims there. And until we came, nobody did anything. I said, you're wrong. We were there before you. You made the difference. Of course you did, because you had all the air power. But he was trying to say that, we've helped the Muslim world, and look what you guys did to us. I said, I didn't do anything to you. But that was the kind of sense that some of the American soldiers felt.
Okay, and so that's how it started for you.
Yeah.
How come things weren't being done there, do you think?
Interests. There was one thing that so Bosnia is a country is made up of Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Muslims. That you can see the obvious one that stands out. Bosnian Serbs have Serbia to fall back on. Bosnian Croats has Croatia to fall back on. The Muslims have nobody to fall back on. So when there was an arms embargo, it affected the Muslims more than anybody else, the Bosnian Muslims, more than anybody else. It was a no-fly zone, that's fine, but everybody else is armed to the teeth. The Muslim groups there suffered the most, of course, and history bears witness to it. And still to this day, we hear just now recently, Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic and all these people have been prosecuted for war crimes 22 years after the fact. So the price that was paid, it was the hemorrhage of Europe. And to this day, we talk about Islamophobia and the Muslim threat, but the biggest threat that's ever happened in Europe since World War II has been against Muslims. It was a genocide. And I think that has to be remembered for the context of what happens next.
Okay, and you're talking about what happened there.
Yeah.
What was it like fighting? What did you see? How did it change you?
I mean, I have to admit that though I had this, I wanted to fight. I mean, I was there in the winter, in a winter period in particular, where fighting had just become, there was no fighting taking place. And it just happened that I was there for about a month or so and nothing happened. And eventually I didn't take part in any military operations. I was there in the training camp. I was there in the back lines, met with several wounded people, heard the stories of numerous people who fought, some who'd got killed, and so forth. So, of course, I was affected by it. But I didn't see the frontline action that I thought I might see. But there's no doubt in my mind that I felt that these people and what they were doing to me was very exemplary and something that I wish could have been replicated around the country.
Okay, so you come back to Britain. What happens next?
So a couple of years later, so part of my journey then, of course, now I've met all of these Muslims from different parts of the world. I am what's the right word?
Networked.
No, I'm taken by what I've seen they're like. I am affected, in a sense. I want to learn more about it. I meet people from the Arab world, and the Islam they talk about and how they talk about it is different to the British Islam that I've heard of. And so I try to research more and learn more and try to engulf myself in learning about Islam and teaching about Islam in the way I think is the correct way and not the traditionalist way of what we learned from our forefathers, from our parents and so forth, but stuff that's kind of based on scriptural texts and stuff like that. And in that context, of course, the idea and the concept of jihad becomes very important. So in my bookshop, we have a bookshop that sells books about creed and belief and jurisprudence and law and so forth. And one of the subjects that we focus on is jihad, the concept of it, the historical concept and what it means. And of course...
emotional word these days, jihad.
It is, other than the fact that a lot of the books that we read at the time had all connected. I mean, the thing that revived the concept of jihad in recent times was Afghanistan when the Soviets occupied. And that had complete, and I mean complete, American and British support and funding. Now, the jihadi world won't talk about that too much because it's kind of, hold on, Britain and America funding us to do jihad? But that's exactly what was going on. Right. The Americans supplied the Mujahideen in Afghanistan with the Stinger anti-aircraft missile system, which helped to knock out those Russian helicopters.
Yeah, it's in the 80s, right?
Yeah, in the 80s. So, and it was the funneling of funds and weapons.
It was a game changer.
Pakistan. Yeah,
the Stingers were a game
Charlie
changer.
Wilson's war, and all of that stuff. So clearly there was interests. Jihad served an interest for the West. Jihad was something that was celebrated. You watch Rambo 3, Sylvester Stallone is with the Mujahideen. And the film is dedicated to the brave people of Afghanistan. So
right. You're laughing now because these days that film wouldn't be made.
No, it wouldn't. I mean, I heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true, but that Sylvester Stallone was told to come back in Rambo 4 and fight against the Taliban, which wouldn't have made sense because these were the same guys that he was fighting along with in Rambo 3. Okay. Yeah.
And so you obviously see all of these patterns of friends and foe and friends again and foe again, and but people forget easily.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. And this is, again, part of my journey, part of trying to learn. In the midst of this, I have to admit that I come across people that are extreme. I come across people who I think are dangerous. I come across people who I don't want to be like them, but that is not going to form my view what I think is right. Just because there's a person that amongst Bosnian Mujahideen, whatever you want to call them, is an extremist that wants to wage war on everybody, that wants to kill everybody, or wants to blow people up. Because he's there amongst them, it doesn't mean that that is the focus, and it's not the focus for the majority of people. But as time goes on, of course, these people do appear, and they start to appear more and more.
Right. What happens when you meet people like that? Because when I listened to all of your adventures, well, by definition, whether you're in aid groups or fighting or whatever, you're going to bump into these people that later become ISIS leaders that you know.
Yes.
How do you deal with them? Do you argue with them? Do you listen? Do you say, I'm on this path? Or what do you do?
Of course, hindsight's a great teacher, but at the time you don't know. I mean, there are people who always say that such people existed. They existed in Egypt, in Algeria, they were in the localized battles that were taking place against the governments and so forth. Only now, which I can say clearly, I have seen the effects of what they can and have done, especially in Syria, especially with ISIS. It's a breed that is it has recurred throughout history, in Islamic history, but it's a breed that is the most dangerous I have ever seen. And primarily because though the West feels that it's a target of ISIS, which is true, the way that ISIS has targeted the Muslim world has no precedent in recent times. And so I know from when I was in Syria in 2012, 2013, there are people I was with, I lived with, stayed with their families for several months, were butchered by ISIS, literally beheaded and killed. And so it's not just a condemn for the sake of condemning, which I won't do, but it's a personal experience I've had. And so when I talk about people who've like that, or who've come across the scene, they're in the context of something bigger, an invasion, an occupation, people being imprisoned, people being tortured. Majority of, I mean, even the leaders of ISIS, I've studied this to some degree, and the leaders of ISIS, 17 of ISIS's 25 leaders were imprisoned by the Americans in Camp Bukka, and tortured and abused at a time when torture and abuse was rampant in Abu Ghraib and other places. So the effects of torture and the effects of abuse and occupation and colonization and all of those things will, for a surety, produce that kind of response.
But can you definitively say that the torture caused ISIS in the years to 2012?
No, I can't. I can't say that it's only the torture. No, there are a series of things that made that happen. There is the internecine warfare between the Shiites and the Sunnis. There's the hatred. If you look at the hatred that exists between the Sunnis, or some of the Sunnis, the ISIS Sunnis in Iraq against the Shiites, there's a history, whether it goes back to Saddam's torture of the Shiites and their retribution after they come in power, or vice versa. And it's still going on now. There's retribution from the Shiites against the Sunnis, and it's non-stop. And the torture, the level of torture is horrific from both sides. People being skewered like kebabs and skinned alive.
Why so horrific?
It's hard to put a finger on it, but what I can say is that torture and abuse and these sorts of violations breed the same thing. And it takes a very, very brave man to come along and say that he's prepared to forgive for the stage next. I don't think anybody's prepared to forgive, not the Americans, not the British, not the Iraqis, not the Saudis. I've yet to come across a nation that says, okay, I'm prepared to forgive to move forward.
Is it also something endemic in Islam itself, with the Sunni and the Shia divide and the different versions of history? I mean, this is going to be hard to get away from in the next 100 years, 1,000 years?
Well, look, let's just compare, right? In Europe, we've had the Protestants, the Church of England, and the Catholics fighting each other for hundreds of years, literally at each other's throats. And only in recent, even the First World War was some kind of result of that. The Second World War, some kind of result of a schism between European powers. So for that to be replicated in the Arab and Muslim world, it's going to happen, despite the fact there's more that unites the Arab and Muslim world than does unite Europe. In Britain, and just look in Britain, we've got 4 countries in Britain that have all histories of being occupied by England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland and Ireland. And yet we've managed a union Europe, now it has the union, it's going to fall apart now that Britain's pulled out. But it has a union despite its history, its culture, its customs, and its languages. The Arab world, you take from Morocco to Iraq and everything in between, speaks one language, has one faith, generally. I mean, there are Christians and etc. So, but generally, and yet, their divisions have been based upon, in recent times, colonization. Somebody came across with a ruler, drew up the borders of Libya and Algeria and so forth.
To a certain extent, but the Sunni and Shia divide is different.
That's true. You're right. You're right. Yeah, it goes back deep, and it is right. And you're right in the sense of these repercussions are happening all over the world. So what's happening in Yemen is a result of that Shia-Sunni divide right now, right? What's happening in Lebanon, it happens in Pakistan every now and then, and there are bombings between the various communities of Shias and Sunnis. So yeah, and Iraq and Syria are probably the worst manifestations of that. And I don't think we're going to get away from that for a long time. It's going to continue. Any
solution for that? Do you ever think about it? Do you ever talk to people about it?
Yeah, all the time. Okay. I've been to Iran. I've met with people there. I've met with senior people there and talked about this proposal, which many people much more powerful and more knowledgeable than me have done before in the past. And we cooperate with Shiite groups over here in the UK when we talk about issues of Islamophobia and so forth. But what do you do when people are at each other's throats, literally killing each other, skinning each other alive?
It's gone too far.
It's going to be a tit for tat, and it doesn't stop until somebody puts his hand up and says, I'm prepared to forgive you for butchering my family. And I don't know who's going to do that.
Okay, you need like a Martin Luther King figure to walk in. And
I don't think even Martin Luther King came across anybody butchering his family.
You're right, yeah. You know? So you think at the West, we're quick to point the finger at what's going on over there, but if we looked in the mirror, we would see a lot of our own divided countries, bloodshed history, etc. And one thing that Al Jazeera always does a great job of, as opposed to, and RT, is covering America and showing how much, you know, that we're killing each other there as well.
Well, look, you know, the United States of America, I came across an American soldier in Guantanamo. I swear he said to me, you know, he's a really lovely, nice Southern gentleman, but he said, the South will rise again. He actually said those words. I said, what do you mean? Do you realize in that war there's 1 million Americans were killed fighting each other over one thing or the concept of the South and the North and what those ideals and values were? America has a history of blood. It had a history of war and killing. There's just no escaping from that, from the Native Americans to the black people to Mexico to internally and then beyond across the world. There's only one country that's ever used nuclear weapons in the history of mankind. And, you know, there has to be some kind of, I think for America, an introspection. America's a fantastic country. It's a wonderful country, and it's hard for me to admit that as somebody that's only tasted the worst of what it can give. But the more I see of what America is capable of and try to look at it with an unbiased view, which I do from time to time, it's a wonderful country. And it's got a lot to offer if it recognized what its potential are and that potential for danger was mitigated.
Yeah, it's a young country, and it was a country built literally on, you know, slavery and racism, like economically. Yeah. So it's endemic, and it's been there for a few hundred years, and it's got a lot of issues to work out. Maybe that's a different show. I was going to ask you, there was a movie called Hell on Earth that was narrated by Sebastian Junger about ISIS, and it came out, I think, recently or 6 months or a year ago, but he kind of dove into kind of everything that was happening in there. I just wondered if you saw it, or it was just interesting to me to see what was happening in Syria, because from the West and from the media, sometimes it's really hard to try to understand. Maybe we can get into that later, because I know you spent some time there a few years ago.
Yeah.
The bookshop, you mentioned you had a section on jihad. Is this how you first kind of got on the radar of MI5 and other people, do you think, or can you tell us about also your thoughts on jihad? We didn't really finish there.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. That wasn't the reason why the security services came. When the security services came to my house the first time, '98, they came to my bookshop. They came simultaneously to my house. They seized some copies of various books, but what they were interested in was that somebody had contacted me from the Emirates, who said that he'd been tortured into signing a confession that he was part of a terrorist group. Now, he wrote to me and asked me to find him a lawyer. He knew I had connections with lawyers, which one of them was Gareth Peirce, which is Britain's most celebrated human rights lawyer. And I contacted her and explained to her that this person's been tortured. And it's my first interaction or on any case to do with torture and British security services being involved. So they came about his case. But of course, simultaneously, they searched my house, they searched my bookshop, and they took some of the books. Some of the books were about jihad, about various concepts of jihad and so forth. And they weren't interested. Long story short, they wanted to see what they were about, and they returned everything, and there were no charges, and the charges were dropped. But it did give me a bit of a shake-up in the sense of, prior to that, I'd been visited by MI5, and prior to that, my view of MI5 was, these guys are like the James Bonds. So when my first visit by MI5, 5 o'clock in the morning one day, I was a bit tired, but almost at the end of that visit, when they asked me about my views on jihad, they asked me about this particular individual I'd written about and sought legal advice. I thought, wow, I'm just being visited by James Bond's organization. Isn't it really cool? And that's what I told my friends. But I didn't realize that this was the beginning. This was the first step in literally the haunting of Moazzam Begg by MI5, because then they turned up at various junctures in my journey in some horrific places where I was tortured.
Okay, and I want to talk about some of those things. What is jihad in your view?
Well, let's start with the pinnacle of jihad. The hadith or the prophetic saying is that the best jihad is speaking a word of truth in front of an oppressive ruler. Now, I think, why? Because speaking against an oppressive ruler, and I mean this particularly in places where there is real oppression, where you can't speak and you can get thrown in prison and tortured. Speaking out in a place like that is going to be much more difficult than, say, taking up a gun and fighting in a battle, because you're definitely going to be targeted if you speak out. So of course that's one aspect of jihad, which I believe in, and I try to believe that I want to practice now. In the past, jihad meant to me a physical jihad. It meant taking part in military action, military operations, fighting an enemy. Jihad meant, according to all the books that I ever read on Islamic jurisprudence and understanding, looking at the Mujahideen who fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets, of whom I met many in the UK. And they would talk about jihad in the way that they had practiced it, i.e. fighting the Soviets, defeating the Soviets, kicking them out of Afghanistan. Jihad in Bosnia to me was a pristine jihad, fighting against people who were involved in genocide. So it meant that to me, and it always will mean that to me. What it won't mean is walking in the streets of Britain or any other country, whether it's in the Middle East or in the West, and blowing up innocent people, or targeting them, or driving cars against them, or chopping them up, or anything. That will never be jihad. That to me will be murder. It'll be, I don't like to use the word terrorism because it has all sorts of connotations, but what it will be is cold-blooded murder.